Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming along to this CLA webinar on water abstraction licensing. We're looking today at how water abstraction licensing will be changing, the importance of it, and actually what you need to know and going forward. My name is Matthew Doran, and I'm the CLA National Policy Advisor on water and climate change in the national team in London. And today we'll be hearing about the importance of abstraction. And water abstraction licenses are a really important business asset, particularly given climate change and an increasingly risky operating environment. The changes that the Environment Agency have been planning and are going to be introducing over the next couple of years will be are critical for you to be aware of. We're here today from John Poole and Andy Turner, senior advisors at the Environment Agency. I'll let them introduce themselves in a minute. After that, we'll hear from Steve Moncaster at Broadlands Water Abstractor Group, who'll give a case study of what he's been doing in Norfolk and how abstractors across the country can prepare for the future. At the end, we'll have some time for question and answer. Throughout the session, if you've got questions, feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom and drop the questions in there. This webinar will be recorded and we'll be sharing it afterwards. You'll get a link via email, and it will also be available on YouTube. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Andy from the Environment Agency.
Matthew, I'll start this. It's for John Poole.
Okay, John.
First of all, good morning, everyone. Really pleased to be here. My name is John Poole. I'm a senior advisor on sustainable abstraction at the Environment Agency. And I'm joined by my colleague, Andy Turner, who will be talking a little bit later in the talk, who's a water resources manager at the Environment Agency. So Matthew, if you could move on to the first slide. So this is a sort of overview of what we're going to be talking about. Just wanted to really just give you just to sort of set it out for you. First of all, we're going to talk a little bit about some basic water resources regulation, set the context of this sort of abstraction licenses, talk a bit about licenses in England and water usage, why it's important, and sort of how we strike the balance. Then going to start talking about the future, talk about the challenges, as Matthew's already mentioned, about climate change and the sort of impacts that might have. Talk a bit about the particular issue, legislation and how things have changed, and some proposals that we're developing on catchment permit reviews. And I'll take you briefly through the proposed approach. Then I'll hand over to Andy, and Andy will talk about the national framework and how a three-tier structure to sort of planning, and he's got some sort of key messages. And then one slide on environmental permitting regulations at the end. So that's the sort of overview, as I say, setting a context and then talking about plans for the future. Next slide, please, Matthew. So this is just a sort of overview, if you like, of the sort of, if you like, the timeline for regulation for water resources. I'll briefly go through this, but just to set the context. The current regime we have was introduced in the 60s, and back then the first licenses after the legislation changed to bring them in were issued in about 1965, and they were based on existing usage. There were some exemptions at the time. Small domestic and surface water agricultural abstractions were exempt, particularly exemptions around dewatering, perhaps of quarries, warping, practice on sort of moors and levels, farming practice, and navigation and trickle irrigation. And that regime was largely unchanged, really, until about the late 80s, in which the legislation came in, which brought in some of those early exemptions, the surface water agricultural abstractions greater than 20 cubic meters. Fish farms were brought into regulation in the 1980s. We also, at the same time, legislation soon after that, the Water Act 2003, deregulated small abstractions that were not exceeding 20 cubic meters a day, and that removed about 25,000 licenses from the licensing stock. Time limited licenses. Some of you may have time limited licenses. The time limiting policy was introduced as a result of the legislation change in 2003. So licenses were time limited from that point, all new licenses, and renewed at common end dates so that sort of impacts could be taken into account in a regular cycle. And then most existing exemptions were ended as a result of that 2003 change. So that was quite a significant changes there as a result of the 2003 Act. And then in 2017, government produced what was called the abstraction plan, and this looked at three strands of abstraction. It looked at how we sort of protect the environment and the measures that we take to protect the environment, a catchment-based approach, which was more a systems type approach where we look at all the pressures in the catchment together and make decisions in collaboration with license holders and permit holders. And then a modernisation programme, moving from paper-based system to a more digital system and a more modern system to give better and more up-to-date information. I'm going to talk about the future now. So what we'll be talking about is what's called a sort of catchment approach to reviewing licenses. We call it catchment permit reviews. Andy's going to be talking about the national framework, as I've mentioned, and environmental permitting regulations. And in my slides, you'll see reference to the Environment Act 2021. And this new provision about where the removal of compensation where licenses are causing damage will take place from the 1st of January 2028. So it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but that's a sort of a bit of an overview, a context setting of the legislation around abstraction and abstraction licenses. Matthew, next slide, please. Yeah, put this one in because I think it's quite important. And this really just shows you sort of what the licensing stock looks like. So there's about 17,500 abstraction licenses in England. And there's also about 2,400 impounding licenses. And these are licenses needed when you impound a watercourse to make sure that the flow can be released downstream, and it sets conditions around that. But you'll see in the pie chart, about 49%, just under 50% of those licenses, these are numbers of licenses, are spray irrigation licenses, and about 15% are agriculture licenses. And obviously, as landowners, those are going to be important types of licenses to you. And obviously, so obviously, there's a lot of licenses held by people like yourselves who are landowners and operate these through your farms or your practices, etc. So that's just to set the context on the numbers. Next slide, please, Matthew. Yeah, this is a sort of a light-hearted slide, a sort of cartoon, but with a serious message. And what this is really showing is there's a balance to be struck. And in the left-hand bucket, the Environment Agency has to balance the environment, ecology and nature to make sure that we're protecting those so that we all have a nice place to live. It says caution SSSI. There's environmental legislation that we have to comply with. So that's on the one hand. And on the other hand, we need to make sure that water is available for those that need it, public supply, to make sure the taps keep running. Agriculture, to make sure that we're supporting agriculture, with their plans, and industry to make sure that we can generate power, etc., and other water users as well. So we're having to strike this balance as we manage through the licensing system and the regulations our water environment. Next slide, please, Matthew. So, just on that last slide, don't go back, Matthew, but on that last slide, lying over the top of that, we have climate change. So that's not a static position. We know things are changing. So we knew we have to adapt to a changing climate. It's in the news, and there's evidence all around us that the climate is changing. The current wet weather, for example, and the stream of storms coming in off the Atlantic. But we know that there's going to be some drier, warmer summers. There has been in recent living memory. Warmer, wetter winters. We're experiencing one of those at the moment. Higher temperatures, heavier rainfall, which will translate into more extreme flows, high flows and low flows as well. So demands are changing. So we still need striking that balance to make sure that we're able to meet demand, but also provide some protection for the environment. And some forecasts show by 2050, some rivers could have have 80% less flows in the summer. So that's in some places, not everywhere, but in some places that's a possibility. So we have to adapt and change. So doing nothing isn't an option. We've got to come up with a different approach. Next slide, please, Matthew. I just thought I'd put a slide in on some of the potential impacts on license holders. So really better planning means more resilience to the climate change pressures and the ability to balance things. So what could this look like? We know there'll be less certainty about the timing and intensity of rainfall. So that might affect irrigation, filling irrigation reservoirs, for example. More vulnerability to extreme dry and wet weather events. Some of the droughts of the last 5 years and the dry weather, put particular pressure and shone a spotlight on water availability, and then the excesses of wet weather that we're also getting. Again, it's that's the businesses will be more vulnerable to those extremes of weather. Seasonal shift, possible with climate change, changes to when we get certain types of weather, later, earlier springs, later autumns, that sort of thing. So there could be a seasonal shift. And changes to viability of land use as the climate changes, having to react and change as the climate changes in the longer term. And then finally, geographical variations on how each watercourse reacts to climate change, proportional to geology and soil type. We're all at different soil types and geologies around the country. Some they would react in different ways, and for example, the chalk geology has a capacity to hold water and store water, whereas perhaps moving further west into the West Country, more quickly running off catchments. So there is this sort of geographical variation, and that will change with climate. Next slide, please, Matthew. So this isn't new. We've been working on unsustainable abstraction for quite some time. And a couple of stats here. Since 2008, there's been a program of license changes and renewals, which has been looking at damaging water abstraction licenses. And we've changed about 400 of them and made quite good progress. I mentioned the time limited license renewals and this regular cycle of renewing the time limited licenses. That's ongoing, and we're changing licenses there. We're also having a dialogue with license holders about unused licenses that just aren't being used, haven't been used for 10 years. And if we can gather those back up into the licensing stock, it gives us more options for other abstractors if that water is on paper not being used, and we know it's not being used, we can use it. So we're doing quite a lot, and we've recovered about 129 billion litres of water retained in the environment. That's largely through the RSA programme. That's a lot of water, and about 1.9 trillion litres of risk of abstraction. So this is the sort of the unused water, which is has been recovered, and that's about the 1.9 trillion is about the amount of water used by London in 2 years, and the 129 billion litres is about the amount of water used annually in the West Midlands conurbation, about 2.5 million people. So big chunks of water, but it's been piecemeal, and it's a piecemeal process that we've had, and the penultimate bullet there sort of says that we've identified that there's about 4,900 licenses that are potentially damaging. So at that pace, we need a different approach, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The maps on the right hand side, there's two maps. The smaller map is a map of geology, and this is giving a very broad overview of where we think this damage being caused, and you'll see the red line there is chalk. We know there's some damage being caused by abstraction there. This is a high level. Doesn't mean that individual licenses in those areas are causing damage. It just means that in general, the water bodies in those areas are showing damage, and as part of our assessment, we would look at that. And then the bigger map is for surface water, and the red again shows where we think there's some damage occurring, and that's sort of the areas that we would look in. Next slide, please, Matthew. So what's changing? What's changed? There's some new legislation, and this is a copy of a photograph of the Environment Act 2021, a new piece of legislation. And there's a clause in here which says that from the 1st of January 2028, damaging abstraction licenses can be changed without paying compensation. At the moment, we change licenses on a piecemeal basis, and we pay compensation where we make those changes. This is a change in legislation, which means that is no longer the case. Water can also be removed from abstraction licenses that have the potential to cause damage and are no longer needed or used. So that's just an extension of what we do at the moment about removing licenses from the stock that aren't used. But why are we doing this? Well, it helps us respond more effectively to climate change, abstraction pressure, but also address current abstractor needs. It allows us to be more reactive, and also, as I'll mention later, take a slightly broader view, a catchment view of water management and abstraction, where there will be more options for us to strike that balance that I mentioned earlier. Matthew, next slide, please. So just want to talk a bit about catchment permit reviews. So this is the sort of what that legislation allows us to do. It's must stress it's currently at a proposal stage, a design stage, and I'll talk at the end of this a bit about some of the trials that we're doing. But it's effectively a rolling program that will address all remaining damaging non-water company abstractions in a catchment in line with common end dates. There's a bit of a mouthful, but non-water company, water companies have their own program of improvements called the Water Environment National Environment Programme, the Water Industry National Environment Programme, the WINEP, and that's funded by Ofwat. So that is happening in parallel with this. But this will allow us to look at all the non-water company abstractions in line with that, but also in line with common end dates. So these are the dates that where we renew the time-limited licenses. And the ambition is to complete these reviews by 2028, between 2028, and 2035, based on those common end dates. And that is so that we can align with the water company programme and change licenses fairly. And that's actually the next point: review of water industry and non-water industry licenses in an aligned timescale. The next point is we can also review time limited and permanent licenses on an aligned timescale as well. So those 2 points there, really, that means we can do things fairly. We can look at the whole picture of water industry, non-water industry licenses, time limited and permanent licenses, and fairly review them on the same basis and at the same time, which is something we can't do now. So we'll be able to get a better understanding of the pressures and how to address them. We're going to focus on current abstraction issues and review and adapt as we go, and also enable sector-derived solutions. So we want to talk to sectors, we want to talk to individual license holders to develop resilient supplies for the future, but get that sort of cross-sectorial support. And we'll be doing that by writing to people and talking to people like yourselves, like we are today. Matthew, can I go on to my final slide? So yeah, catchment permit reviews. What we want to do is give abstractors clear, timely information about any changes that might be coming forward, about the changes in the legislation and climate pressures. So we want to make that sort of information available so that abstractors can make informed choices. And we'll do that by writing and speaking to license holders as we progress. Remember, this is a proposal at the moment, so there's nothing to do at the moment. This is a proposal. We want to give abstractors confidence that their abstraction is sustainable and supports their future business needs. So through this process, we want to sort of have robust information and that enables abstractors to have that confidence. We'll provide a framework in which regulators, abstractors, and interested groups can work collaboratively. That's a key word, collaboratively, where we can identify options and solutions together where abstraction is causing damage. And looking at problems in a catchment sense across the board will enable us to have more options about how we do that. We want to give abstractors time to adapt, depending on environmental risks. That's important, adaptation time, and also work with nature where possible. Finally, just to let you know, I keep sort of stressing this is in development at the moment with the proposal, but we're trialling it in 4 areas, and you can see the green dots there just show you where we're trialling this approach. We're just starting that now in the Hull and East Riding area, up in Yorkshire, Upper Bristol Avon, just north of Bristol, in the Wey sub-catchment of the Thames, and on the Ribble and Douglas up in the northwest. So different sorts of catchments, different pressures, and they will give us a sort of a view on how this will work. Matthew, I think that's my final slide. Hopefully that's helpful. If I can perhaps move to Andy next.
Thank you, John, and good morning, everybody. So as John said, I'm Andy Turner. I'm a Water Resources Manager in the Environment Agency. My team's role is probably twofold. My team leads on the development of the national framework for water resources, which I'm just going to run through shortly. But also we are the lead team for helping the agriculture sector improve its water supply resilience. So we work very closely with the likes of Matthew, Steve, the NFU, others, to try and help farmers and growers, landowners plan for and deliver options and measures that will help improve the security of supply. So I'll touch upon some of those as I run through the slides. So Matthew, if you could take us on to the first one, please. So the national framework. The national framework is the planning framework in England for water resources management. It is a document and a process that enables water resources planning to be done on a number of geographical scales. You can see 3 scales that I've identified there. But more importantly, it's the mechanism for joining up different sectors of use. A lot of water planning historically has taken place with water companies, and what we are trying to do is to improve the join up with different sectors of use such as agriculture, energy, navigation, industry, and others. So we're trying to get a much more multi-sector approach. And we have a framework, national framework, that was published in 2020. We are currently revising that and updating some of the analyses within the framework. And we are going to publish the new framework later this year. And what it will do is it will quantify the scale of the pressures on water resources. And it will set out some of the actions that we, who do I mean by we? Government, regulators, water users, different sector representatives, everybody, we all need to do to work together to address some of those challenges. So there will be a call for action in there. What the framework does, it sets out the national approach, but it also sets the mandate for regional water resources groups to operate, so that there is a more refined view of what is needed on a regional basis. Each of the regional groups will be able to better coordinate and identify strategic solutions across the different sectors, particularly getting water companies to join up so there are strategic solutions in place, and they can facilitate the delivery of local action. So there's an important role for regional water resources groups there. But most importantly, I think there is space for local planning and delivery. And in particular for the sort of agriculture and landowner sector, it involves space for catchment planning and the establishment of water abstractor groups, which I'm sure Steve will touch upon in a bit in his talk. And what we're trying to do is to promote the establishment of groups of abstractors so they can work together to plan for and look at joint solutions and options, such as sharing water or developing joint infrastructure. And if they're not able to do that, then at least they can have a stronger voice. So that's what we're trying to do on the national framework. And if we sort of take a step back, the Environment Agency has an overview role on how water resources are managed in England, and it's our job to ensure that there is proper use. So, this look at ensuring that water needs are planned for properly is a really important part of ensuring that there is proper use, as well as the sort of water efficiency side of things that we will challenge each sector to demonstrate. Excuse me. And John has run through the licensing system, and he's run through how we ensure that the environment will remain protected through the licensing system. But I think it's also worth worth emphasising that the licensing system is there to protect abstractors from each other. It's there to ensure that new abstractions do not interfere with existing abstractions, and water rights remain protected so that existing users can enjoy the use of the licensed water that they have. Matthew, if you could take us on to the next slide, please. So in our national framework that we will publish this summer, we will be including these messages amongst many others. What we want to do is to raise awareness of some of the future pressures on water resources, and John has run through some of those in his talk. We want to improve collaboration, not just between farmers and growers, but across different sectors of use. So I've mentioned the water abstractor groups there as well. We are supporting water resources planning and drought planning activities through a range of studies and assessments. And one of those assessments, those studies that we've been running we've been running a program of local resource option studies, which get groups of farmers together to look at the resource development or water sharing options that might be available in their patch, and to screen them and rank them and make recommendations about which ones would be the best ones to take forward. And we've been working with DEFRA to see if we can strengthen the link between those recommendations and grants, etc., for delivery of those recommendations. So we've got a high-level planning right the way through to delivery. Other notable things, we have been investing in our IT. We have a system of water abstraction e-alerts, which will quickly notify abstractors when water is available to take under license conditions and when it is not. That way we can maximise the use of water when it is available, but better protect the environment and downstream users when it is not. The other one I think I will draw out from this slide is near the bottom, smart farming. One of the big things we want to do in the future is move towards smart farming, where we will look at using technology and IT to improve knowledge and information on water availability near real time, and also look for that technology to help with irrigation scheduling. So, probes and monitors in the field to look at soil moisture, lots of other environmental parameters that will help identify how much water is needed, where and when. And we want to work with farmers and growers to trial that in a number of catchments so that we can understand how that might link to a future improved abstraction licensing system. So lots of planning and trials being put in the system for that, for the near future. And the big one for me, I think, is water sharing that I'll finish on. I think there are lots of opportunities within the agriculture sector, particularly for water to be shared, for licenses to be aggregated, for licenses to be restructured so that existing water rights can be more effectively used and distributed amongst groups of farmers. I think that's a big thing that we should look for the sector to work through on a collaborative basis. Matthew, if you go on to the next one, please. My colleagues who lead on preparing for the environmental permitting regulations, unfortunately, are not able to be with us today. So they've provided this slide to give you an update on the planned move from the existing legislation to the environmental permitting regulations, where a lot of the other regulatory regimes that the Environment Agency is responsible for, where they sit. Now, after that big build-up, if you can go to the next slide, Matthew, the update is that there is no news, there is no update from the position that we've been in for quite some time now. We have made recommendations to the new government around what the approach should be, what the implications are, what the timescales for preparation need to be, and we are waiting for ministerial approval to proceed. So we cannot enter into detailed engagement with stakeholders until we get that green light, and then we can talk. Once we do have that green light, we can talk more confidently about what it will mean with stakeholders, and we will do that when that happens. So I'm sorry we don't have any further news to give you. So our best estimate is at the earliest it will be next year. My bet would be later on in next year rather than spring, before we see any implementation of a change across to EPR. So that's the update there. And then I think it's back to John now for some summary messages about
Thank you, Andy. Yeah, and it sort of builds on some of the things Andy was saying at the tail end of his presentation, but this is sort of just practical tips, I suppose, on what you can do to prepare for the future. Just wanted to put this in, and also there's a couple more slides with some useful links, which I think you might find helpful and useful. But and a lot of this is obvious stuff, but I'll just briefly run through the slide. But think about how you use your water now and how you could do things differently in the future, bearing in mind the sort of climate pressures, etc. Other ways you could reduce the amount of water you take, or consider innovative technologies. And Andy mentioned smart farming. Is there as technology advances, is there a better way of doing things? Thinking about sort of the change in climate, capturing flood water might be a great option, given that wetter winters, warmer winters, and storing that water. Solutions involving collaboration, abstractor groups Andy mentioned, and the local resource options, and working collaboratively with other license holders and other groups. So there's some simple things here, but also another key message is that if your license is impacted, we'll work with you to explore viable options and work in collaboration. It's not just about changing licenses. There's a whole raft of discussion and collaborative working that we can discuss with you on impacts, and moving to a catchment scale. There may be slightly more options as well. We'll work with the abstractor groups where available to improve access to water, secure water supplies, and prepare for the future. And of course, license. This one really, the last one's about just being proactive. License holders can apply voluntarily to change their licenses at any time and adapt to the evolving situation. So it's just worth bearing that in mind, that if you have a solution that you think is viable, talk to the Environment Agency about how that might work. So it's just some practical tips. Hopefully that's useful. And then no need to go through the next two slides, Matthew, but there's some useful links there you can see there, and the next slide as well. You can see some useful links there that you can access to that will help you. And that's back to you, Matthew.
Thank you very much, both of you, for that presentation. I'll now hand over to Steve Moncaster. I'll let him introduce himself and his presentation. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Matthew. So good morning, everybody. My name's Steve Moncaster. I'm the Membership and Technical Advisor for the Broadland Agricultural Water Abstractor Group, or BAWAG. That's a collection of about 100 businesses in Norfolk, predominantly food and farming businesses, with an interest in the abstraction and use of water. So BAWAG's been around for about 20 years, mainly as a discussion forum, And in the last sort of 4.5 years, we've had to make quite a change in the way we operate and become a bit more technical. And most of that is to deal with the sort of issues that John and Andy have been talking about in their presentations. So that sort of journey that we're all tasked with to restoring abstraction to sustainable levels, which in kind of plain English for many people means license reductions. And of course, license reductions in a catchment where there are many abstractors is a very complicated process and something quite easy to get wrong. So what I'm going to show you in the next few slides is why you may want to join a water abstractor group to kind of take some of the pain out of that process and get a better outcome, both for you and your businesses, but also for the environment as well. Next slide, Matthew, please. So a big part of what we've had to do in Norfolk as a water abstractor group is convert all the things that Andy and John have been talking about into what does that mean for me? So if I'm an abstractor sat in Norfolk, the agency are talking to me about several different programs in relation to licenses. Some of them in the short to medium term, some of them with longer term drivers, and it's for most people it's a fairly sort of challenging process to kind of engage with. So the first thing we can do as water abstractor groups is bring a bit of clarity to that. And what I want to show you on the next two slides is if we look at Norfolk, if we look at all the things that we know that are going to happen there through what John and Andy have been talking about, then we can separate things into really what's going to happen in the short term, so really the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and then what we need to get prepared for in that follows that, so 5, 10, 15 years. In the short term, we're dealing with catchment reviews, so an ongoing process of capping time-limited licenses, removing unused licenses, and that sort of things linked to common end dates. So that's something that kind of trundles along. But we've also had in Norfolk quite a bit of work linked to the habitats regulations, which started in the east of the county in a place called Catfield Fen, but has kind of mushroomed since then. So now we have we're dealing with 3 programs at the moment linked to the HABS regs. The stuff in the Ant Broads and marshes, which is kind of brown in amongst all the green stuff. Following a judicial review that was had in 2022, that program is extended to the rest of the Broads. So there's 23 triple SIs in the Broads, which are now being looked at in terms of the effects of abstraction on them. And then what's followed that is a very similar program linked to the Norfolk Valley Fens. Now, and the shading on the map is a 5-kilometre radius of all of the site. And in practice, that sort of 5-kilometre rule has emerged as quite a useful indicator of whether or not you may have an issue linked to a triple SI, in this case subject to the habitats regulations. Well, all of this stuff has a 2027 deadline, so it's really quite immediate for us, and I'll show you in a couple of slides time that time presses with these things, and the agency like to give as much notice as possible and talk about 6-year lead into license changes. In practice, there are bits of that program that are highly compressed, and it really pays to be well prepared to deal with particular bits in a 6-year program, which is where all the decisions are made. If we go to the next slide, Matthew, the previous slide was the short-term stuff, October 27. If we then think about catchment permit reviews, which John was talking about, and a process of looking at triple SIs, other designated sites, the map kind of fills in. So anywhere that wasn't coloured in Norfolk before is now pretty much coloured in, and that tells you, certainly in Norfolk, that we're in a county that has a large number of designated sites. So if we go back to John's cartoon of the EA balancing between triple SIs and the abstraction of use of water for people and industry and agriculture. Norfolk is really a place where we have that challenge in spades. So we have European sites subject to habitats regs, very tough environmental targets associated with them. And then if you look at the rest of the county, then there's lots of triple SIs. And if you look on the CABA website and talk to people like the Rivers Trust, there's a particular interest in things like chalk catchments, chalk streams, which as we get into environmental destination and longer term planning for our catchments and abstraction in our catchments will become more significant. So the first message from my slide is this is a big problem or a big challenge. It's something that you can't ignore. You really need to engage with this because it will happen in the short, medium, and long term, and in Norfolk pretty much everywhere. Next slide, Matthew. So if I go back to where it really started for BOAG, things turned technical for BOAG in 2016 when there was a public inquiry linked to a set of abstractions near a place called Catfield Fen. What happened following Catfield Fen? So the appeals that were subject to the public inquiry were unsuccessful. So abstractions were time-limited licenses were not renewed in that instance. But following the public inquiry, the programme was widened to include triple SIs in the Lower Ant Valley, which is the dark green areas on the map there. So that work started in 2016. In 2021, the agency published their report, which contained details of the licenses that would either not be renewed or would be revoked. And those are shown as the blue and red dots on the map. So the first thing to note is this thing about the 5 kilometre rule. Within 5 kilometres of the triple SIs in the Lower Ant Valleys, quite a large number of abstractors were affected. And this is, of course, the first driver for getting into an abstract group or some kind of collaboration is typically you're not on your own dealing with this. There are other people going through the same process, and working together is quite a useful way of dealing with that. The point I was trying to make earlier about the 6-year timeline, and in practice that being quite a lot shorter than that, is the report emerged in June 21. The technical reports followed at Christmas. It was only 12 months later that the Section 52 notices were issued. So the window for influencing the decisions that are made by the agency in respect, certainly of the HABS regs and the Ant Broads and Marshes, was actually quite narrow, and it wasn't 6 years. It was quite a bit less than that. From June 21, the licence changes are imposed in October 24. Which means if you wanted to move from an unsustainable or groundwater abstraction with issues, let's say, to a new, more sustainable source of supply, in this case, a surface water reservoir, you've got 3 years to build that, and that is tough. That is a challenge. The real message is you need to be organised. You need to be dealing with this well before it becomes a problem. You need to be understanding what the issues are from the agency's point of view and the NGOs and other people that have an interest in the abstraction and use of water. So next slide, Matthew. So what does getting well prepared for that kind of problem look like? Well, for us in BOAG, we went to the agency. We asked them if we could have a copy of the regional groundwater flow model that they used to investigate these issues. The agency very kindly let us have a copy of the model, so we're able to start using it. And the model, like all groundwater models, is really designed to look at a system, so take a system-wide view of abstraction and sustainability related issues, and then sort of start to explore effects linked to individual abstractions, but also groups of abstractions. So in licensing language, that's either an alone effect or an in combination effect. So really, it's by picking up the agency's models and tools and using them, working within this network of 100 abstractors in Norfolk that are part of BAWAG. That's really the way that you move towards collaboration and all the benefits of collaboration, which in the main part are about accessing a wider option set than you have as an individual, and options which are in practice probably more cost effective, certainly in terms of sharing cost and risk. So if you want to make that step to collaborative solutions to deal with the big programs that we know are coming forward, you really have to be in a group. I mean, that's basically the message here. If we go to the next slide, Matthew, please. One of the things Andy talked about was smart farming. So as I said, the the agency and everybody else has recognised that we have quite an old system actually for managing licenses. What we've seen in Norfolk is the disadvantages of that when we start to look at reducing licensed abstractions. So initially we're faced with sort of whole license reductions based on thresholds that are applied to the driest month of the driest year. So a very conservative kind of static view of the solution to sustainable abstraction. Clearly, in this day and age, there are better ways of doing this. As Andy said, a lot of that resides in technology and the way we use technology. This is work that's in progress with BAWAG at the moment. So we're installing equipment at a farm in the Broads, which is adjacent to one of these triple SIs, which is a special area of conservation. The question we're asking ourselves in this case is, what does it take to maintain abstraction on a farm in proximity to a triple SI without compromising the integrity of the triple SIs? And so we think the answer to that lies in data. It lies in a better understanding of risk for the triple SI, and then combining those things in a farm water management plan that allows abstraction without threatening the triple SI. And the whole thing is really data driven. We're cutting our teeth in this case study here on this one farm in the Broads to get to where Andy was talking about in terms of sharing water between groups of farms, which has to be a really excellent way of dealing with all of the risks that we have now and in the future. We need to see this kind of technology replicated at kind of sub-catchment or catchment scale. And as we work with Andy and the pilots that he puts together, and we look at what we're doing down here in the Broads, then hopefully that will emerge as an option for abstractors, and our hope is sooner rather than later. My final slide, so quick one to finish on. Looks like it's got a bit gobbled up there, but we earlier this year we had another public inquiry in relation to license reductions in the Broads. The lessons that we took from the KC, from the legal team that supported us: start early with a plan, absolutely crucial. Be prepared to compromise, work within the EA processes. So there's no point trying to undermine those. Those are the rules. Those are the things that we have to work with. Invest in the evidence. Get the best team. Start early. So start early is really important. My message to support all of that is that's all a lot cheaper if you're in a group with 100 other businesses sharing the cost. And if for no other reason, you should be interested in a WAG, because all of this planning stuff costs money, and it's far better if that's shared. Thanks, Matthew. That's it from me.
Thanks very much, Steve. And apologies that the slides, that some of the bullet points didn't quite come through. So now we're going to move into Q&A, and I'll stop sharing so I can see the Q&A function. At the bottom of your screens, there's a box that says Q&A, so please feel free to put any questions in there. I believe you may also be able to upvote questions as well if you agree with someone else's. But whilst questions are coming in from the audience, I've got one for you, Steve. So what happens if there isn't a water abstractor group in your local area? Yeah, what can CLA members do in that case?
So, so there's quite a lot of effort at the moment going into setting up water abstract groups, and this is being tackled in two ways, Matthew. So on the one hand, Andy's working with each of the regional planning groups that have been set up through the National Framework for Water Resources. Those guys have been tasked with supporting the development of WAGs within their areas. So they have a budget. They have essentially coordinators who are looking at abstractors within each of the region and looking for opportunities to form or support the development of water abstractor groups. The abstractor groups themselves, so the ones that are existent and are functioning, so BAWAG, SWAG, LARC abstractor groups, other groups, have their own organisation, the Water for Food Group, and the Water for Food Group is also supporting the development of WAGs. So there's plenty of people out there. Melvin, as Melvin Kay, is going to be running the UKIA conference this year based on the support we've had in the sector from the agency. So there'll be a lot of stuff said about LROs and other projects. But there'll also be an update there on water abstract groups. So there's a lot of stuff out there. If anybody's on this call and interested and doesn't know what to do, by all means call me and I can help kind of get you set up and going.
Thanks. I've got a question in the chat from Emma Powlett. Given that planning is expensive and can take a long time, this is a question to the Environment Agency. What influence does the Environment Agency have over local planning authorities to ensure decisions are made promptly? And also, are decisions for permissions made more positively and quickly if applicants intend to become smart farms?
So I'll start off on this, and then John, if you want to add, if you've got any further points to make. So I'll assume that this is around planning decisions for infrastructure and in particular for farm storage reservoirs in my response. So often you will need an abstraction and or impounding license, and you may also need or are likely to need planning permission for the same development. They are two different processes. We do work with the planning authorities to try and ensure that the information requests, the environmental reports, can be used for both purposes where possible. It's daft to have two sets of similar requirements, so try and join up. We have fed into a government review of permitted development to set out pros and cons of planning decisions being taken generically. I think that the government's position is that they're not going to enable permitted development for high flow storage reservoirs because of the likelihood that there will be site specific differences in each case. They all need to be looked at in their own on their own merits. So so we are working with local authorities. We are working with the RPA as well in terms of linkage with grants. And there's been the DEFRA Water Management Grant that has been available recently. We're continuing to push for that to be continued and for high support rates and for wider things to be considered for DEFRA water management grants, so that the link is strong between local resource option recommendations and the ability for some support. So that's it on local planning and also the RPA. But in terms of the agency's work, we have a team in our national permitting centre that prioritises applications that are linked to water management grants, because there are some specific timescales associated with qualifying for those grants. We have specialists who are available to provide consistent advice to our officers who might not routinely pick up these complex and specialist applications. So we're sort of fast tracking as many as we can.
Andy, I'll just add, if it's okay, sort of in relation to sort of local planning applications, often our area teams, our local teams, are consulted on planning applications, and we have an advisory capacity there. So we'll provide advice that might be on water resources, water quality across the piece, but we'll provide advice, flooding as well. You know, and obvious, I mean, not obviously, but you know, some of these proposals, smart farms, etc. You know, that could be, we could certainly be in a position where it's a very positive thing, the application being made and supporting it around smart farms, etc. But yes, it's locally, it's an advisory capacity on planning applications. That's where the influence would be. Yeah.
Thank you. That's very helpful. We've got time for one more question. I can't see any more. Oh, I can now see a second from Emma. Just appeared. Do you have a timescale in mind for a new round of water management grants, as it's gone quiet for quite a long time now? Also, with Upton Broads, did they get a grant, and is funding a barrier to becoming smart? A couple of questions there. I'm not sure who wants to take those to begin with.
I can take the first part about the grants. So the water management grants are run by DEFRA, and the Rural Payments Agency administer those grants on behalf of DEFRA. I think that DEFRA, when the new government came in, had wanted to look at the grant schemes that it had in the round, including the water management grant scheme. We've behind the scenes been, like I said, extolling the virtues of the water management grant scheme and pushing for it to continue. I'm not sure whether anything has been announced yet, but I've not seen anything that suggests it will not continue in some way, shape or form. But that's for DEFRA to announce when it chooses to do so.
Sandy, Upton Broads, is that for you, Steve?
It is. So we did get a grant for that. So we had quite a large grant from the Farming in a Protected Landscape, or FIPL programme, to help get the thing going. Is funding a barrier to becoming smart? I think at the moment possibly, but what we really want to do is, because we're cutting our teeth at Upton Broad, is we really want to create a really strong case actually for more investment in technology around smart farming, and I think the real test of its value is not whether we can measure everything on a farm, because we can do that now. You know, it's can we take that into the licensing system and get that more modern approach to licensing that Andy and John have talked about, with benefits like sharing. I think at that point it becomes really investable, but we need some decent case studies, I think, just to show what's possible for farmers and also regulators and funders.
Thanks, Steve. I think that's time on the webinar, unless anyone has a very quick last question. If not, I want to say big thank you to all our speakers today for their time preparing the slides and coming to present. you do have a question that you think of afterwards, feel free to send me an email. So my name, matthew.doran@cla.org.uk is my email address, or give me a ring, and I can pass that on to Steve, Andy, John, if I can't answer it myself. As mentioned at the start, we've been recording the webinar, and we will post a link to the video. So if you've got colleagues, neighbours, anyone else you think might want to listen to the webinar and find it useful, please feel free to share it on. I believe you'll get an email with the link to the webinar recording in it. So thank you very much all for coming, and I'll close the webinar there.